The cockpit of TWA Flight 514 was a place of quiet professionalism as the aircraft cruised at altitude, heading toward Washington Dulles International Airport. It was December 1, 1974, and Captain Richard Brock, First Officer James Lofton, and Flight Engineer Joseph Chianti were in control of the Boeing 727-231. The sky outside was thick with winter clouds, and the crew monitored their instruments closely as they approached the airport. The passengers in the cabin were relaxed, some gazing out the windows at the vast, white-covered landscape below, unaware of the looming danger. The flight attendants performed their routine checks, ensuring everyone was buckled in and prepared for the descent. As the aircraft neared its destination, the crew received a clearance from Air Traffic Control, ATC. The controller's voice crackled over the radio, instructing the flight to descend to 7,000 feet. Captain Brock acknowledged the clearance, adjusting the controls accordingly. However, there was a subtle misinterpretation of the instruction, one that would soon prove catastrophic. Without realizing it, they were flying toward disaster. Inside the cockpit, the crew prepared for descent. Captain Brock, a seasoned aviator with thousands of flight hours, was focused on the instruments. First Officer Lofton, relatively newer but highly competent, worked alongside him, ensuring they followed ATC instructions. A misunderstanding occurred as they interpreted the clearance differently. The approach controller had expected them to remain above 7,000 feet until further instructions, but the pilots believed they were cleared to descend immediately. This subtle difference, in a world where precision was everything, would have dire consequences. The aircraft, now gradually descending, moved lower into the storm clouds. The outside world was an endless white mist, eliminating any visual reference points. The altimeters ticked downward, but the pilots felt no urgency. After all, they believed they were following the instructions perfectly. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the passengers continued their conversations, oblivious to the unfolding mistake in the cockpit. Flight attendants secured last-minute checks, unaware that the aircraft was descending toward terrain far sooner than it should have been. It was a classic case of miscommunication and assumption, a lethal combination that had sealed the fate of many before them. As the aircraft descended, the radio chatter remained routine. Other flights checked in with ATC, receiving their own instructions. Controllers were juggling multiple aircraft, each relying on precise coordination to ensure safe arrivals. However, something crucial was missing: the Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, a device that alerts pilots when they are too close to terrain, was not yet a standard requirement on all aircraft. This meant that the crew of TWA Flight 514 had no automated warning to tell them that they were dangerously close to the mountains surrounding Washington, D.C. In the cockpit, First Officer Lofton looked at the charts. The flight path seemed clear, and the altimeter still showed they had some altitude left. But outside the aircraft, hidden beneath the thick clouds, was a looming ridgeline, one that was rising far faster than the pilots anticipated. Then, a sudden gust of turbulence rocked the aircraft, causing some passengers to grip their armrests. A few exchanged nervous glances, but turbulence was common during winter flights. Captain Brock steadied the controls, reassuring his crew. What none of them knew was that the ground was racing toward them at an unforgiving speed. Inside the cockpit, a quiet alarm went off. The altitude was dropping faster than expected. First Officer Lofton's brow furrowed as he double-checked the instruments. "Captain, are we cleared this low?" he asked hesitantly. Captain Brock, still focused on the descent, glanced at the instruments and nodded. "We're fine. ATC cleared us." But outside the aircraft, a different reality existed. The mist-covered peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains were now dangerously close. The aircraft was on a collision course, but without a GPWS, the only thing that could save them was visual confirmation of the ground, and that was impossible in the thick fog. In the cabin, a few passengers sensed something was off. The usual, smooth descent felt steeper, more aggressive. A mother tightened her grip on her child's hand, an unconscious reaction to a rising sense of unease. Flight attendants continued their duties, unaware that in just a few seconds, the world around them would turn into chaos. Then the first officer's voice rose in pitch. "Captain, check our altitude again," he urged. But it was too late. A fraction of a second before the inevitable, Captain Brock's instincts kicked in. He yanked the yoke, trying to pull the nose up, but the aircraft was already in a critical position. The engines roared in protest, but physics was against them. A deafening crash shattered the silence of the Blue Ridge Mountains as the Boeing 727 slammed into the wooded terrain. The impact was catastrophic. Within an instant, the aircraft broke apart, its fuselage shearing. As it carved a scar into the mountainside, inside the cabin, chaos erupted. The front section of the plane was nearly obliterated upon impact, while the middle and rear sections sustained violent forces that threw passengers and crew against their seats and overhead compartments. The sheer violence of the crash made survival impossible for those at the front. A fireball erupted as fuel ignited, sending a thick plume of smoke billowing into the freezing air. The once peaceful winter landscape was now a scene of twisted metal, scattered debris, and shattered lives. For those who perished instantly, the nightmare ended in a blink. But for the few who survived the initial impact, the true horror was just beginning. As dawn broke over the Blue Ridge Mountains, the wreckage of TWA Flight 514 lay scattered across the frozen landscape, a grim monument to a tragedy that had unfolded in mere moments. Emergency responders, bundled against the biting cold, picked their way through the smoldering debris, searching for survivors. Though hope was dwindling, the rescue mission soon transitioned into a recovery effort, the reality setting in that there were no souls left to save. Not long after, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, arrived on site. The scene was harrowing, charred, remains of the fuselage, jagged pieces of metal twisted by the force of impact, and personal belongings strewn across the mountainside. Each item told a story, a life interrupted in an instant. The team's priority was to recover the flight data recorder, FDR, and cockpit voice recorder, CVR, the so-called black boxes that held the key to understanding what had gone so catastrophically wrong. The NTSB quickly set up a base of operations, mapping out the crash site in painstaking detail. They cataloged wreckage patterns, noting the way the plane had broken apart on impact. Initial observations suggested that the aircraft had made no evasive maneuvers before crashing, indicating that the pilots had likely been unaware of the impending disaster until it was too late. Investigators theorized that the aircraft had been fully intact upon impact, ruling out structural failure or an explosion as the cause of the crash. The team found the FDR buried beneath a section of the wreckage, its casing battered but intact. The CVR was recovered shortly after, and both were rushed to NTSB headquarters for analysis. The painstaking work of listening to the final conversations of the crew, decoding flight parameters, and cross-referencing them with ATC communications would soon reveal the chilling truth behind the tragedy of Flight 514. The first news reports of the crash hit the airwaves within hours of the wreckage being found. The footage of burning debris and rescue teams combing through the snow-covered forest flashed across television screens nationwide. As details emerged, speculation ran wild. Was it a mechanical failure? Pilot error? Air traffic control negligence? Families of the passengers and crew gathered at airports and airline offices, desperate for answers. Grief-stricken, they clung to hope that perhaps there had been survivors. But as officials released official statements confirming the loss of all on board, sorrow turned to anger. How could a routine approach to Washington Dulles end in catastrophe? Aviation. Experts appeared on news programs offering early theories. Some pointed to the weather conditions, noting that thick cloud cover and turbulence may have disoriented the pilots. Others speculated that an outdated approach procedure or miscommunication with air traffic control may have been factors. Keen-eyed journalists began digging into the history of controlled flight into terrain, CFIT incidents, noting that similar accidents had occurred in the past due to misinterpretations of altitude clearances. TWA already under scrutiny for previous safety lapses, faced mounting pressure as headlines demanded accountability. As public outrage grew, government officials promised swift action. The FAA announced a full review of approach procedures and began discussions about mandating the installation of ground proximity warning systems, GPWS, in all commercial aircraft. Flight 514 was rapidly becoming the catalyst for sweeping reforms in aviation safety. Inside the NTSB's headquarters, a team of specialists worked tirelessly to extract data from the black boxes. The cockpit voice recorder provided a minute-by-minute account of the final moments inside the cockpit. As analysts listened, they heard a calm but confident flight crew, following what they believed were the correct descent instructions. Then, they heard the rising concern in First Officer Lofton's voice, his hesitancy as he questioned their clearance. The final seconds of the recording sent chills down the investigators' spines. The urgency in Lofton's voice increased as he realized they were too low. "Captain, check our altitude again," he had exclaimed just before the impact. But by then, it was too late. The sound of alarms, the frantic attempt to pull up, and then silence. The flight data recorder confirmed the crew's belief that they had been cleared to descend further than they actually had. The altitude data aligned with the approach controller's clearance, but the pilots had interpreted it incorrectly. They thought they had been authorized to descend immediately to 1,800 feet, when in reality, they were supposed to maintain 7,000 feet until reaching a designated waypoint. It was an error so simple, yet so deadly. The investigators knew that this misunderstanding wasn't unique. Other pilots had made similar misinterpretations in the past. This was a systemic issue, one that needed addressing immediately. The findings of the NTSB's investigation sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. The final report placed the primary cause of the crash on the crew's misinterpretation of ATC instructions, compounded by the lack of a GPWS. The FAA moved swiftly, mandating that all commercial aircraft be equipped with GPWS technology, which would provide an automated warning when an aircraft was dangerously close to terrain. Additionally, revised communication procedures were introduced, ensuring that altitude clearances were unmistakably clear to pilots. Pilots across the industry were retrained in how to handle ambiguous altitude instructions. Airlines incorporated new simulator scenarios based on Flight 514, reinforcing the importance of double-checking altitude clearances and questioning unclear directives. The changes were not just limited to the United States. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, reviewed global approach procedures, urging airlines worldwide to adopt stricter protocols for CFIT prevention. The legacy of Flight 514 was shaping aviation policy on an international scale. Years passed, but the memory of TWA Flight 514 remained strong. On the anniversary of the crash, families and aviation professionals gathered at a memorial near the crash site, honoring the lives lost. The names of the passengers and crew were engraved on a plaque, a solemn reminder of the consequences of a single moment of misinterpretation. Pilots visiting the memorial often paused in reflection, knowing that the tragedy had led to some of the most critical safety advancements in aviation history. The lessons learned from that fateful day were now ingrained in training programs worldwide, ensuring that future generations of aviators would never make the same mistake. For those who lost loved ones on Flight 514, the pain never truly faded. But they found solace in knowing that the sacrifice had led to meaningful change, preventing similar accidents from happening again. As the wind whispered through the trees of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the echoes of Flight 514's final moments remained a powerful testament to the importance of clear communication and the relentless pursuit of aviation safety.